Welcome to Leveraging Diversity and Authentic Perspective on Issues of Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Dr. Nicole Price, and I'm pleased that you've joined us today. One of the things that I always like to do is to let people in on my biases. You should know that I'm a chemical engineer by degree. And why do I tell you that? I spent almost 2 decades studying problems that are pretty easy to be solved, technical issues, things that there's a root cause, or maybe there's several root causes, but there are professionals who can help us explore those root causes and come up with specific ways to fix them. Issues of diversity and inclusion don't really fall into that category. People are not problems to be solved. And so what my hope is today is to just talk about the ways in which things like solving problems are different from things like resolving issues around diversity and inclusion and how we can move forward on those issues. My biases will come through for sure, and you feel free to call me on them anytime you see them show up. There are a few foundational ideas that I always like to address just to make sure that we're thinking and talking about the same things and have some shared language. The first thing I'd like you to do is to just look at both of these 2 columns. And as you consider each column, I want you to think about which group is more powerful. Now, when I ask that question, I don't want you to think about which group you wish were more powerful, or the 1 or 2 people you can name who happen to be more powerful in one group versus another. I want you to think globally. Think the rule rather than the exception to the rule, and which group is more powerful. When I ask this question of thousands of people in audiences all over the globe, the answers are usually pretty much the same. White people are more powerful. People in marriages tend to be more powerful. Adults are more powerful than children. Straight people have more rights and privileges than people in the LGBTQ community. Rich people are more powerful than poor people. Men happen to be more powerful than women, as evidenced by when you look at how many men run Fortune 500 companies, how many men represent us on a governmental level, how many men, even in industries where women tend to be the majority, tend to run those organizations. School districts come to mind. People who are born in urban environments tend to be more powerful and have more access to resources than people who are born in rural environments. And one that people never disagree on is that people with college degrees tend to be more powerful than people with GEDs, which takes me to my very first invitation and foundational idea. And that is to acknowledge what is. You see, when we acknowledge that there are social power structures, that doesn't mean that we agree with them. That doesn't mean that we think they're right. That doesn't mean that we support them. What it does mean is that we can see. There's an adage I like to use, and it is, I'm a present day realist and an eternal optimist. If you walk into a room and everyone had red hair, would you notice? The answer is yes, you would notice. Noticing is not the issue. Treating people differently based on what we notice sometimes can present challenges. But we have to acknowledge things before we can change things. And sociologists and social psychologists have told us this since the beginning of time. Most people are very comfortable and familiar with organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. And the very first step in all of those organizations is to acknowledge that there is a challenge. If we don't acknowledge it, we can't even begin to try to work towards resolving it. Second foundational idea is surrounding what you do in your agencies or in your organizations. I want you to think for a moment, what are the things that sometimes get in the way of your nonprofit being the most effective it can be? When I ask that question, oftentimes there are certain things that bubble up to the top. Lack of resources, not being able to get the grants we need, or perhaps we find that we can't find the talent we need. Equipment that doesn't work, people who don't get along, inability to be able to service all the client needs. Whatever your challenges are, I want you to hold those in your mind. Think about them long and hard. And then imagine I come to you and I say, look, We're going to institute some diversity initiatives. What's your reaction? I like to tell a personal story about a trip my girlfriends and I take every year. We've known each other for 20 years, and every year we take a trip together. And it's not very long because some of us have just started our child rearing years, and others of us are running businesses. And so we're busy, but we take 3 days every year, just the 10 of us enjoying each other. Well, one year, one of my friends brings her sister. Now, we love her sister. And on the surface, it's not really that big of a challenge. But when you consider that her sister is vegan, and we are from Kansas City, where barbecue rules all things around us. Several of us are from North Carolina. Our parents are pig farmers and we love pork. You start to see that her being a vegan could potentially cause a challenge. Nothing that's insurmountable, but a challenge. Now you add in that she's a Christian, not really that big of a deal, but she's the kind of Christian who doesn't drink. Well, on this trip, we drink, and we drink far more than we should. And so it's not, again, do we have an issue with vegans? Absolutely not. Do we have an issue with people who don't drink? My husband doesn't drink. Of course not. But those two things have kind of shifted the environment for us on our girlfriend trip. Now, third and final challenge. She's a new mom, and she's a new mom who is nursing. And so some of our day-long trips where we're gone all day without access to refrigeration, with no private spaces for her to be able to pump and store milk, have presented a challenge. So we have a vegan who does not drink, who also is a nursing mom. That difference has created a challenge. It does not mean that as an individual, we have any issues against her at all. It's just that she shifted what our trip looks like. That takes me to the second idea. Diversity hurts. And when we don't acknowledge that, we don't acknowledge the thing that you felt when I talked about or asked you to think about all the things you have going on in your organization. And then I show up and I speak about diversity issues. There are places in this country where I can go and all they need to hear is, we're having a diversity and inclusion workshop, and people come in and the eyes start to roll. Why is this uniquely important for people who run nonprofit organizations? Part of the reason why you might have insisted on joining a nonprofit is because you didn't want to deal with the bureaucracy of a corporation. And so you like to just skip through some of those little things like setting up team norms, having team building sessions where people can get to know each other. But because diversity hurts, I want to invite you to think about what would it look like if you did bring people together to talk about how things would be different. Case in point, using my girlfriend trip. What we can do to think about before we get on the trip is, what are her dietary needs and how can we be supportive? The last thing we want to do is to end up someplace where there's nothing for her to be able to eat. And now the trip is not going well for her, and it's also not going well for us. It would behoove us to have a conversation about why she doesn't drink. What are these religious preferences, or does she have some aversion to alcohol, or is it just a moral compass by which she lives? Will we offend her by drinking alcohol while we're together? Those are things that we need to talk about before we get on the trip. And then, considering that she's a nursing mom, she's already identified several challenges with finding lactation facilities, just navigating her life. She probably has really good solutions for how we can accommodate her on the trip. But all I'm saying in short is, instead of just throwing a bunch of difference in a room and hoping for the best, what I invite you to do instead is to understand that diversity hurts, and it's far more painful if we ignore the difference is there. So I want you to think about, what is your definition of diversity? When I walk into the conference rooms all over this nation and people cringe a little bit and they stiffen up, it's because they think of diversity as, I call them the top three suspects: race, gender, and sexual orientation. But if you look up the word diversity, it simply means difference. And I can go into a team that looks homogeneous in every way, and still there will be challenges around diversity. And so if we can think about diversity in general, more broadly, it is a better way to approach the topic than to start the topic with issues like race and gender and sexual orientation. Now, here's what I don't want you to think. What I don't want you to think is that diversity doesn't mean race, gender, and sexual orientation. It absolutely does. Those topics just tend to be emotionally charged and intellectually challenging. And so I advise any nonprofit organization to start somewhere else, to start in places where people can build their competence, build their skill, build their ability and their muscle to have conversations around difference that allow them to learn strategies first and then bring in the more difficult topics. So diversity, difference. There are two types of difference. There's difference you can see and difference you can't see. And I know that might seem simple, but these are authentic perspectives around issues of diversity and inclusion. And I bring it up for a very specific reason. It is far easier to discriminate or to be prejudiced against diversity that you can see. Think for a moment about sharks. When you consider sharks, how many people do you think die each year from shark bites? As you're watching this recording, I want you to actually write the number down. You should know that it is less than 10 people around the globe who are killed by sharks each year. Now, why do I bring that up? When people choose to be discriminatory or prejudiced or bigoted, and they do something that we all would kind of clutch our pearls and go, oh my God, I cannot believe that. It is so egregious and awful. I like to call those shark bites. And I call them shark bites because if by chance I was ever bitten by a shark, someone would come to my defense. They would immediately see the trauma and the damage. They would work really hard to stop the bleeding. That's what it looks like in organizations when people are bitten by sharks. When there are egregious behaviors, typically they're written in our employee handbooks. Typically, no one has to question whether or not it was damaging. And so there's all kinds of support for shark bites. But I want you to remember that only about 10 people every year around the globe are killed by sharks. Now, this little insect is a mosquito, if you don't recognize it. I want you to think about how many people are killed based on mosquito bites every year. And when I ask this question, people go, killed based on mosquito bites? Well, when you consider all the complications of mosquito bites, malaria, West Nile, and all other mosquito-borne illnesses, that number gets really close to 1 million people who die every year from mosquito bites. And in 2020, oftentimes the things that people experience in our very nice and well-meaning nonprofits are mosquito bites. We don't work in places where people show up being awful and create shark bites for other people. By and large, it's people who their heartstrings have driven them towards nonprofits. And so, of course, they're not shark bite kind of folks. But mosquito bites, if I came to you and I said, a mosquito bit me today, many people would go, what? A mosquito? Like, what is the big deal about mosquito bites? But what if you had gotten bitten by a mosquito 50 times in a day? What if you were in an area where malaria or West Nile was prevalent and you had gotten bitten by 50 mosquito bites in a day? What are the implications? So there's a story I like to tell about my son. He attends the University of Southern California. And when he first started to go there, he would wear his shirt very proudly to let people know that he was at USC. And the first few times when he was wearing a shirt and he was on a plane, people would say, "Oh, do you play sports?" And I would be livid, and he would say, "Oh, mom, you just want to be oppressed. This is what I do for a living, so I recognize mosquito bites when they happen." But I tried to allow my child to have his own lived experiences. And so once he became a junior, he had tired of the question, "Do you play sports?" And here's why. You see, my son's friend, Jake, also attends USC. And a couple of times he's been on the plane with Jake. And the question Jake gets when people find out that Jake attends USC is, "What is your major?" And so my son then asked Jake, "How many times, Jake, has someone asked you, do you play sports?" And Jake said, "Never." And so what was interesting was, at the beginning, my son was thinking, well, I'm pretty athletic, so it could be that they're asking the question because I'm pretty athletic. But Jake, who plays tennis at the collegiate level, never gets asked that question. You should know that Jake has white skin and my son has black skin. And so those are examples of mosquito bites. Now, when he gets the question, "Do you play sports?" it's the 500th time he's been asked that question, and he can't help but contrast it with the experience of Jake. And if he were to say something to someone about it, they would say, "Well, you look like an athlete." Well, it's a reasonable question to ask. But that is because we don't understand the implications and the danger of mosquito bites. So the formal term for mosquito bites, microinequities. Some people call them microaggressions. Big word for little small things, so small that we don't see them as biases in the ways that they show up. They are disrespectful actions, however, and they're subtle, sometimes so subtle that they leave the person on the other end wondering, did that really happen? Is there some other reason why that might be true? And that is what causes more stress than the shark bites or outright aggressions. Because stress is cumulative, and cumulative stress is far more dangerous. Here are some examples of microinequities. Notice who causes you to roll your eyes when they speak. Notice whose name you get correct and whose name you say, well, do you have a nickname or something else people call you? I invite all my clients to consider, we know how to say Mark Zuckerberg. We know how to say Condoleezza Rice. We know how to say George Stephanopoulos. And because we know how to say those things, we have to practice how to say everyone's name, especially the 10 to 12 people with whom we work every day. It might be subtle, but excluding people from social gatherings and not allowing them to have the choice of whether or not they want to participate or not. Women often talk about not being given credit where it's due, sitting in meetings and giving ideas only to have them repeated by a male in the room, and then everyone listen and say, "Oh, that was a fantastic idea," when a man says it. And then finally, introducing everyone and not introducing a singular person. These challenges have plagued us for centuries. I do not anticipate that I'll be able to change them tomorrow. They're rooted and grounded in social power structures and in systems. However, I do fundamentally believe that if I can get people to think differently about these challenges, to stop denying what exists, to own and honor that diversity hurts, to recognize that it's the subtle things that cause us far more damage than the larger things, that we can, centuries from now, see a difference. So all I'm here to do is to try to shift the mindsets. There are 3 dimensions through which I talk with organizations about this. They are the personal dimension, which what are your individual responsibilities and how do you individually experience any of these things? Then there's the leadership dimension. Leadership does not mean reporting structure. Leadership means that I am an influencer and I have the ability to influence the work climate for everyone I work with. And how do I adjust to those things? And then finally, the institutional dimension. How do we look at our policies, practices, and procedures and see how they include some people and exclude others? Today, because we're short on time, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the personal dimension. The personal dimension is dependent on you understanding your unconscious biases and your implicit associations. And so one gift I am going to give to you is some post work for some things that you can do to strengthen yourself on a personal level as it relates to issues of diversity and inclusion. One thing that's included in that post work is the implicit association test. The implicit association test was created by Harvard, and I believe almost 27 years ago. And it was created so that we could see what decisions and what actions do we take when we are not thinking. So if we talk about my girlfriend trip, let's imagine that we didn't have any conversations about it. And we were just like, oh, your sister's coming. That's wonderful. And we didn't talk about it at all. My son is 21 years old. It's been a long time since I've been a nursing mom. I take the trip to get away from my husband who does not drink. That is a joke, and I hope that you laughed. And let's just imagine that every time I do a fast that requires me to be vegan, even though I know it's what's best for my colon, I know it's what's best for my personal health and my mental capacity, I'm looking forward to these trips so that I can eat all things that are not vegan. Those are things that are in my head, even if I don't explicitly say them. And so what does it look like on day 3 when we're in the middle of our massages and she says, oh gosh, I've got to find a place to get some more ice for my cooler before we can go to our massage appointment? Am I likely to roll my eyes really quickly without paying attention? Am I likely to take just a little bit of a breath? Am I likely to make that little fake smile that we make sometimes where we try to force our eyes to see what our lips are doing? Those are implicit associations, and those are the small way. I have all kinds of implicit associations, and small little subtle things will come out in my behavior when I'm not thinking about it. And so why is it important for us to take the implicit association test? It's because it gauges what we do, what we think, how we're likely to respond when we are not thinking, when we are tired, when we are stressed. And all of us need to know those things about ourselves. I like to tell people that the implicit association allows us to take our blinders off, to see the spaces where we might be creating mosquito bites for others. Here's an example. So here on the right of your screen, this is a kindergarten assignment. And just in case you think this is from the 1970s, this is from last year. And I work with my clients to see how these kind of things show up in their marketing materials and in their agencies. The child is encouraged to draw a face to match the feelings of the children on the page. But the implicit word associations are that a Black child is sad or angry, and a white child is happy or proud. And so I invite people to think about, when I put this on the screen, what are the long-term implications of not telling children to treat everyone the same, but teaching children to treat everyone the same? You see, there's nothing on this page that tells children to treat people differently, but this page is absolutely teaching children to treat people differently. And so the implicit association test would bring up for the instructional designer who put this curriculum together the thought to say, what children are being disparaged because of the work that we are putting out? And that's what we have to do for all of our organizations. There are some common reactions to the implicit association test. And there's far more resources at the Kerwin Institute, but I want to talk about what some of them are. One is disbelief, like, oh my gosh, these results can't be right. Let me tell you, there's nothing you're going to feel comfortable about being biased against. Remember, the test is not measuring your conscious biases. We're not asking you, if a Black young man goes to USC, does that mean he plays some sport? We know that if we asked you to think about that, you would say, of course not. The implicit association test is measuring for you when you see a kid with a USC shirt on a plane and they happen to have black skin, are you more likely to ask them about sports than you are about their major? That's what it's measuring. Disregard is the one that gets me on my soapbox. There are people who take the IAT and they try to outsmart the test. There's one thing that is a part of my personal constitution I always want you to do, and that is not to waste your time. So if you think you can outsmart the test, just don't even bother to take it. The third reaction is acceptance. And that's where people land and they say, well, what can I do now? I want you to be super careful there too, because remember, many of these things have been going on for centuries. I want you to be intentional. Think about your values. Think about your own personal mission and vision, the mission and vision of the place where you work, and then identify what you can do now. 4 is discomfort. There are millions of people who will never even have the courage to take the implicit association test. I'm grateful if you do, and know that there's nothing that's going to feel good about me learning maybe that I might be biased against people who practice Hinduism. The thing is, in my embarrassment, if I feel distress, what's necessary then for me is to decide and determine what I'm going to do next. And again, the Kerwin Institute has lots of resources for you to consider. When you came on the planet, I want you to think about who taught you how to be. Was it a book at school where you colored in the faces on the children? Was it your parents? If it was your parents, did you have both a mom and a dad? Or did one of your parents die early? Were you raised by your grandparents because both of your parents were working? Did you spend most of your time at the daycare? What did you learn from your daycare providers? Do you have siblings or not? And how did that shape what taught you what was acceptable and right? Did you go to school in an urban environment or in a rural environment? Was your school large or was it small? Was it a religious institution or not? All of these things shape and form what we perceive to be what's right and how to be. All of those things are prejudices. Everyone has prejudices. If I said to you, children should be seen and not, most people raised in the United States of America will say heard. Now, just because you can repeat an adage that says children should be seen and not heard, that does not make you a bad person. It means that you have a prejudice against children. Not because you decided, but because you heard it over and over and over again. What are the implications of that? It means we can't control our prejudices. I can't control what song lyrics I've heard. I can't control what billboards I've seen. I can't control who reared me or what religion my parents were and exposed me to. I can't control any of those things. Prejudice lies in our brains. And it means that sometimes when I'm angry, lonely, tired, or hurt, my prejudice might come out in the form of discrimination. And so when I am tired, I might exclude a child. And when they're advocating for themselves, I might attack them in ways that I wouldn't when things are working well. So while prejudice is inside our head and everyone has it, discrimination is when prejudice comes outside of our head and how we treat others. We have to get our language clear around this because people get so offended and hurt when they hear that they have prejudices. They get offended and hurt when they hear that they have some bigoted ideas. And we all have them. They're all inside of our heads. And we all, at times, when we're angry, lonely, frustrated, or hurt, and when we're just not thinking, it comes out. What does that mean for you and your organizations? I implore all organizations to insist that their leaders take the implicit association test. I do not advise that you have people to openly share them, but I invite people to take them so that they know what prejudices are in their heads. And then look at when you decide, for example, who should get promoted. Has that been influenced by anything related to our implicit association test? And are there some groups of people that we exclude based on what the implicit association test told us? When we favor certain people, what have we noticed about the similarities or differences in those people? There was an exercise I was invited to do at one point, and I was asked to think about, in the middle of the night, it's 3 a.m, who do I call if I have a challenge? Let's imagine I have to invite somebody to help me move or loan me money. Who am I calling? I'm working on a major project and I need to talk through the details with someone. Who am I calling? Who do I spend my time with on the weekends? And the facilitator invited me to write all of those names down. And then she asked me to look at the similarities in the group. And that's when I realized that based on education, I'm pretty discriminatory. Based on lived experiences and people from the Midwest, I can be pretty discriminatory. And it's important for leaders to know that so that we can fight against it. What are some small things that we can do in order to fight against it? I call those micro affirmations. They're not always big things. Sometimes they're small gestures of respect that make people feel included. They're so small that you might not feel like they move the needle. I say change is incremental. That does not mean it is inconsequential. Here's a list of micro affirmations. Try as best possible, once you know you have implicit associations for or against certain groups, to remove your judgment from a person or a particular situation by sitting down and asking yourself a series of questions. Questions that say, am I looking at the actual qualifications? Am I looking at ways in which I can be a little more accommodating? As you know more and learn more about yourself through the implicit association and other assessments, do better. Involve. Be sure to keep everyone in the loop. I love basketball, and I love basketball on the NBA level. And during the NBA season, I would find that I would end up talking to more men on my team than I was women. Because on Mondays, I would want to talk about the games that happened over the weekend. And in my organization, as a rule, not as an exception, but as a rule, men cared more about that than women. And so I had to make sure that I found other things to make sure that I was encouraging and talking with people who did not value the NBA as much as I did. That was another way to be socially inclusive. Value. When I hear someone make a suggestion and then someone else make that same suggestion in the subtlest, kindest way possible, I'll say, yeah, and that's the second time I've heard it. And so now that Jenny has said it and Tom has said it, I think it's something we should consider. It's still nice. I'm still honoring Jenny. I'm still honoring Tom. But it's my way to make sure I'm giving credit where credit is due. Finally, difference is one of the few topics that people don't feel like they have to educate themselves around. And it's not our fault. We've been reared in an educational system that does not necessarily encourage us to educate ourselves about difference. Now, before you get started going too far, the best way to know the most about other people is to be very, very clear about who you are and what your background is. If you honor and acknowledge all the good things about yourself and all the bad things about yourself, it'll help you be far more empathetic and compassionate when you're trying to learn about others. Case in point, when I go back 21 years ago and I think about what it was like to nurse my child when they did not have lactation facilities inside the airports and everywhere else, my heart opens up for a sister who happens to be on a trip who just simply wants to feed her baby. And so remembering what it was like to be in the shoes of another is incredibly important. So live, let go, involve, value, and educate. And so finally, what I'd love for you to do, I've shared lots of information with you here today. I want you to think about the top things that you want to do. Try to pick 5. 5 is far too many, but I want you to write down 5 and then circle the one that really tugs at your heartstrings. Is it going to be to take the implicit association test? Is it going to be to do the post work? Is it going to be acknowledging what is? Is it going to be acknowledging that diversity hurts? And so instead of throwing a bunch of difference together and saying, oh, we're just one big happy family, actually doing some team setup? Is it going to be looking out for mosquito bites instead of being overly focused on shark bites? I don't know, but I want you to write down 5 and I want you to pick one. Pick one, and I want you to be relentlessly focused on that one thing for the whole year. That's how we move the ball on issues of diversity and inclusion. We just keep working at it.